this is topic 9.8, 9.9, 9.10 from the course and exam description for AP Environmental Science on invasive species, endangered species, and human impacts on biodiversity. All right, we have several learning objectives as we go through this presentation. The first one, EIN-4.A, I can explain the environmental problems associated with invasive species and strategies to control them, come from the College Board's course and exam description. Then we have more specific learning targets developed by the textbook listed below. All right, first you need to know what an exotic species is, or an alien species. So that is one that's not native, so it's not normally in that area. If it becomes a problem, it becomes an invasive species. So an alien or exotic species will turn into an invasive species if it's successful there and it breeds and it causes trouble. It outcompetes the native species. It might eat the native species. It causes too many problems to the natural biodiversity and natural food webs in that ecosystem, then we call it invasive. These species tend to be R-selected and generalist. Now, R-selected is something we learn in Unit 3. That means they produce a lot of offspring, and they don't particularly always care for their offspring. That's R-selected. And then a reminder that a generalist is one that can live in a variety of habitats and can eat a variety of food. Okay, so here are some examples, some very famous examples of invasive species. Mosquitoes weren't normally in Hawaii, they were brought in. Norway rats hitched a ride on boats from Norway all over the world. And then zebra mussels also hitched a ride inside of ships. Their larva was in the ballast of ships they come from southern Europe, in kind of Eurasia area. And they made their way and are causing problems in the Great Lakes and consequently other lakes as they spread through people's boats. Now, some are intentional. For example, they're introduced, like European honeybees were introduced to the United States to help pollinate crops, so they're not all by accident. Okay, so the reason why honeybees were brought in was to pollinate the crops. Kudzu vines, this is a picture here. We don't have these in California, so you may have never seen these before, but they're in a lot of other states, including where I used to live in North Carolina, and they grow over the existing trees. It's a vine, but what happens is that they use the tree to grow up on top, and they basically block the tree from getting light through photosynthesis, and they can smother and kill the trees beneath it. They were brought in to reduce erosion on land, but they kind of took over. In California, we have invasive ice plant in the coast. It was brought in from Africa to control erosion, but it's ending up outcompeting other native plants on the coast, like coastal erosion. You can see some more examples here, the silver carp. Invasives are difficult to control because they don't have natural predators. One method we can use, we can bring in a natural predator, but that has to have a lot of studies done to make sure that natural predator actually wants to eat what it's supposed to eat when it's brought in. Prevention, you need to know this, prevention is the best method. Okay, so we are currently in our 6th mass extinction caused largely by human activities. You need to know the definition of an endangered species, one that is likely to go extinct in the near future. Before they are endangered, they can be classified as threatened or least concerned, near threatened. There's a category, a continuum of labels for species. You need to know what the IUCN is. They track data. They place species in critical, like super, gonna become endangered super soon if we don't do anything about it. So they track endangered species throughout the world. Okay, so we have endangered species by type. Conifer is a type of tree. Think of like a Christmas tree is a type of conifer. You can see that threatened or endangered is in orange, so you can kind of see the different species and which ones are more or less. You don't have to know that for your AP test, but it is an interesting pie chart. Currently, amphibian species are the worst, and they have the biggest threat for being endangered, mainly due to pollution. They're indicator species as well. So what determines whether a species could become invasive? So there are some species that are more likely to become endangered. If they are slow to reproduce, like whales, it's hard for them to replenish their population after they were hunted. Hunting whales was banned over 100 years ago, and most populations are still endangered because they only have babies like once every couple, 2-3 years, and one at a time, very slow to reproduce. Is their habitat still intact? That can influence whether they're going to bounce back. Are they interacting with humans? Do they get food from humans? Do they not get food from humans? Or are they food? Are they food for humans? Do humans hunt for them to eat them? And can they successfully compete in a world with other animals and species to compete for resources? Okay, we are also concerned about genetic diversity. So it's not just the numbers of species. We will also want to make sure they're genetically good. For example, zoos. Zoos have a big database of the genetics of their animal species. So if you're in a zoo and you're like, we want to breed gorillas because they're endangered species and we want to get their populations up. Well, if your gorillas in your zoo have already bred enough and you don't want to breed their offspring together because nobody wants to do that for genetic diversity. So they will arrange trades with other zoos so that new genetics can come in and breed with those endangered species. So zoos will trade animals a lot for a couple of years to increase genetic diversity. We have inadvertently declined genetic diversity of some of our larger predators, especially when they've been in a genetic bottleneck. And then we also do that on purpose with our agricultural products. For example, there is a lot of diversity in livestock. You can see these are all different types of cattle, but what you see mostly around is just a few kinds. Okay, so while we grow different varieties of things, like what's in the grocery store, even in the produce section, is bigger than when I was a kid. We have more things there, but those things that are there have little genetic diversity. This can cause a problem in the future. For example, in the past, in the 1800s, there was an Irish potato famine. It killed 1 million people in Ireland. Many thousands and tens of thousands immigrated to the U.S. to escape the famine because they were relying on potatoes as their food source. And when there was a fungus that came through called the potato blight, they had nothing to eat. So when you're reliant on one kind of crop or one type and there's not genetic variation, diseases can come in and wipe it out. To help with that, we're saving seeds. So anytime we find some sort of a home farmer who grows their own type of broccoli that is not normally grown by other people, scientists will come in and ask for those seeds. And they store a lot of seeds in a seed vault, places that get really cold to preserve the seeds. So we have a backup of genetic diversity in case our food supply is threatened with diseases and things. Okay, so we have our decline in domestic animals. So cattle, sheep, goats, pig, poultry we keep for food or for eggs or for milk. And you can see that our number of breeds have declined. A lot of them have become extinct, so the different genetic varieties have declined over time. Okay, there are several causes. Now you do need to know this. Actually, let me go back a second. You don't have to know this graph. You will need to be able to know that genetic diversity has declined among our crops and livestock. And if you're given a graph like this, you need to be able to read and interpret it. But you don't have to memorize the information on it. Okay, you do need to know this though. HIPCO, that's an acronym to help you remember the ways that species become endangered or extinct. Habitat destruction, invasive species, human population growth that puts pressure on other species, pollution, climate change, Overexploitation, overharvesting. Think of hunting species, gathering too much, that kind of thing. Okay, first we have habitat fragmentation. This is the #1 cause. You need to know that. It's the #1 cause of species decline is habitat destruction. And so you can see here they cut down a forest to build homes. This would be our neck of the woods. They remove our chaparral shrubland ecosystem to build homes. You're going to reduce the habitat, and some species can't live among humans. Others can, most cannot. And you can see here we have lots of tree loss in the entire world with it in red. Okay, forests aren't the only habitat that's lost. I showed you the picture of our shrubland, our chaparral. Another thing that you need to know is habitat fragmentation. That's when we leave certain patches, but that reduces overall biodiversity as well as genetic diversity. So you have a smaller space, you're more exposed to predators, you can't find things to breed, you can't find others for genetic diversity for breeding, and then some species won't cross. Like why doesn't the chicken cross the road? Well, some species won't cross this area. Others will, some will not. Okay, the second clause of decline in species biodiversity, so remember our HIPCO, we have I, invasive species. And then human population, so the P, population. We do activities, lots of activities, habitat loss, lots of things that decline species. Then we have the next P, which is pollution. So we have pesticides, metals, acids, oil spills, air pollution, water pollution, etc. The next one is climate change. So our patterns of weather, etc. Now humans have really caused the climate change, and so certain species can't live in the same area they used to. The water in the ocean's too hot in that area, and they've got to move or go extinct. If they can migrate, they will. Same thing with plants on land. A lot of our plants are going to move north in the northern hemisphere and south in the southern hemisphere to get to cooler places. Then overexploitation, we've driven many species to extinction. For example, here's the dodo bird that was on the island of Mauritius, and 100 years ago became extinct just because people hunted and killed it for food. Okay, so there's a couple of ways that we can improve biodiversity. We have what's called the single system approach and the ecosystem approach. Okay, single system is like what we do in the Los Angeles Zoo with the California condors. We breed them to try and get those populations up, and they can be successful. So in Santa Clarita, we have a breeding program for gibbons, which are endangered species, over off of Bouquet Canyon Road, and they work to get those populations up of endangered gibbons. There's some legislation that focuses on individual species. The Lacey Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, are two that are interesting. You can pause the video and read about them. The Endangered Species Act you have to know for your test, and it not only stops you from killing those species that are endangered or threatened, but it also you can't hurt their habitat. So you cannot, even if you own a piece of land, you can't do bad things with that land. You can't sell it and cut down the trees. You can't build homes on it without permission if there's an endangered species on it. Okay, so there's also people who don't like the Endangered Species Act. They're like, it's my land, I want to do whatever they want on it. So there is backlash. You need to know about the Endangered Species Act. The next law you need to know is called CITES. It's called the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. But you just need to know it as CITES. You don't have to memorize the full name. So basically it's an international treaty that keeps species from importing endangered species parts. So it bans ivory, it bans rhinoceros horns and shark fins and things like that. The IUCN also manages a red list, which is a list of species that cannot be traded under this convention. And so you do need to know the provisions. What does it say? These are the provisions of the CITES. Okay, I'm going to pause here and we're going to continue with the next video to continue this section.